Hello and welcome to another exciting lecture for Introduction to Psychology. In this chapter we will be talking about health, stress, coping, conflict, a little bit with aggression, those types of things. So as a preview of what we're going to look at stress, panic disorder, appraisals of stress, some stressful experiences, some stressful responses or responses to stress. Then we'll transition a little bit into health psychology, looking at the immune system and how it responds with stress. We'll look at some resistances to stress, and we'll finish up kind of in a different line by talking about behavioral types. We'll look at positive psychology, we'll look at conflict, just kind of to finish up along lines of not just talking about stress. I'm going to start out with a video on the next slide.
What's the difference between stress, anxiety, and worry, and why does it matter? Most people talk about stress, anxiety, and worry interchangeably, as if they're the same thing. For example, my test really stressed me out, I was so worried about it. Or, I'm so worried about this upcoming performance that it's making my stomach hurt. Now, the lack of differentiation between these different aspects of anxiety leads to difficulties in knowing how to resolve the effects of them. So today we're going to talk about the difference and why it matters. So worry is the thinking part of anxiety. It happens in our frontal lobes, the part of our brain that plans and thinks and uses words, and it has to do with thoughts like, is she mad at me? Or what's going to happen at my upcoming performance? Now, we humans have developed this part of our brain for important reasons. Worry helps us solve complex problems by thinking about them, perhaps over and over again. But if worry becomes distorted, compulsive, or stuck into a repetitive cycle, then we can develop disorders like depression and anxiety. Now, stress, on the other hand, is the physiological response to fear. So it's what's going on inside of our bodies when we're reacting to something that's perceived as threatening or dangerous. It's the fight, flight, freeze response and is rooted in the reptilian brain. Now, it's instinctual and unconscious. Stress serves a perfect function in helping us to escape real threats. For example, the sweating that comes along with stress helps us stay cool, or the adrenaline helps us perform in situations where we have to run away or fight off a physical threat. However, if stress becomes chronic and remains unresolved, it can have serious consequences in our bodies. High blood pressure, heart disease, cancer, and chronic illness are all associated with stress. Anxiety is the intersection of these two reactions, the thinking and the biological response. It's rooted in the limbic system, and it has to do with this feeling of foreboding or dread, like something bad is going to happen. Anxiety helps people be watchful for danger. But if it dominates our lives, it can make it hard for us to feel joy and to move forward in the direction of our values. If we want to learn to manage our anxiety, we need to learn to tailor our interventions to the different aspects of stress. So in order to manage our worry, we need to target those thoughts with cognitive interventions, changing how we think and changing what we're constantly imagining and visualizing in our minds. And if we want to change the stress response, we need to take a bottom-up approach, incorporating our body's reactions and responses into interventions that change those reactions and responses into a healthy way. The first step of emotion management is awareness. Start to pay attention to what it feels like when you're having an anxious response. Is it rooted in your mind? Are you having thoughts or imagining some future catastrophe? Or is it rooted in your body? Are you having these physiological reactions like an upset stomach or sweaty hands? And as you start to pay more attention to these reactions and gain more awareness around them, you'll develop greater ability to learn how to respond to these instinctual reactions in a more helpful way. See if you can distinguish between the two aspects of anxiety, the worry and the stress. Maybe even spend some time writing about it. And Stay tuned to this channel for my next videos on how to regulate each of those aspects of anxiety. Hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching. Take care.
Okay, now that you've got that information, which will be helpful for the understanding the rest of what we're going to be doing here, now let's start to look at some of these things, like specifically stress. So stress occurs when anxious or threatening feelings come about when we interpret or appraise a situation as being more than our resources can adequately handle. What does that mean? Basically, stress is a physiological and psychological response to threat and anxiety. And that's where you kind of get a bit of a difference between the stress and anxiety there. So the anxiety can cause stress, but the anxiety itself is not stress. Important here is stressors. These are conditions or events that will cause stress. And this can be anything from something that is typically viewed as stressful, like a deadline, to something that wouldn't be typically viewed as stressful by many people, such as walking around in public, but is stressful to others. And then finally, coping is the things that we do to manage and reduce stress. So we'll come back to coping as a mechanism in a little bit. On the other hand, you have anxiety. In that video, I explained anxiety as kind of that bridge between worry and stress. But anxiety is going to come about as this feeling of uneasiness or apprehension that we have to various different things in the world, usually due to a potential future or a potential situation, a potential future event or a potential future situation. These result in increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, and these develop mainly in one of three ways: either classical or observational conditioning, which we talked about earlier in the semester, or due to some unconscious conflict that's present that we're not aware of. So anxiety comes about when we've typically, due to some prior event, something occurred and it caused anxiety, or it caused us to have a specific reaction, and now we are, in a sense, dreading or having anxiety about that situation in the future. In our modern environment, we typically have anxiety over things like taking tests. So we have test anxiety. Next thing we'll look at is panic attacks. So panic attacks and then panic disorder. So what is a panic attack? A panic attack is basically a period of intense fear or discomfort. And when I say fear, I don't just mean a rational fear. Actually, panic attacks typically come from irrational fears. So what is happening during this time? You have a pounding heart, sweating, shortness of breath, chest pain, dizziness, fear of losing control or dying, that type of thing. One thing I'll say about panic attacks is panic attacks are relatively common. Most people will have a few panic attacks in their lifetime. And again, panic attacks are typically when, or almost always when, there is no direct reason for the panic to occur. If you see a predator in the wild, or a spider comes down from the ceiling and lands on you, that's an actual reason to have panic. A panic attack is where you've got this intense fear or discomfort without really a reason for it. As I was saying, most people have panic attacks in their lifetime. I can talk about one that I had. I was working early in the morning. It was like 5 a.m. And all of a sudden, for absolutely no reason, my heart just started pounding. And then I started sweating. I knew what a panic attack was. I knew I was having a panic attack. That didn't save me from having the panic attack, though. I continued to have the panic attack for about 15-20 minutes. Just my heart was just pounding. I was sweating. little bit of feeling of dizziness and things like that, but again, it was more of just my heart started pounding, and even though it was cold, I started sweating. It went away, and I haven't actually had one other than that. That's the only panic attack I've had in my life, and there was absolutely no reason for me to have it at the time. I knew what it was when I was having it, so I was, even knowing what it was, I still was barely able to calm myself down after a period of time of 15 minutes. So the point I'm trying to make is panic attacks are common. What is uncommon, though, is panic disorder. Panic disorder is where you have recurrent unexpected panic attacks. And what ends up happening is an individual becomes so worried about having another panic attack that intense worry starts to actually cause panic attacks. So an intense worry of having panic attacks causes more. And one of the big things here is people with panic disorder will stop driving because they fear having a panic attack while driving and crashing. Well, they fear having that panic attack while driving, and now for some reason they have to drive, and they end up having a panic attack because they were so worried about having a panic attack while driving. If we were doing abnormal, we'd talk about this more, but I'm just going to move on since this is a chapter more focusing on stress. As far as treatment for panic disorder, and this is one where and when we talk next week, when we look at the abnormal stuff, we'll look at a bunch of different things and look at treatments for them. I just kind of wanted to hit up, well, how would we treat panic disorder? And there's some things that can be effective here, but really what we're looking at is there's two different types of things that we look at for treatments of most disorders. On one hand, we have drug treatments, and on the other hand, we have therapy or therapeutical treatments. So in this case, we've got drug treatments and cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy, also called CBT, is a very effective therapy technique that's used that basically works on adjusting cognitive thinking as well as the behaviors associated with it. So when you're talking about panic attack, it's something to reduce the cognitive worry about having a panic attack, as well as the behaviors that people do to avoid certain situations because they're worried about having a panic attack. What's actually been shown is, though, that in the long term for panic disorder, that CBT alone is the most effective. It's even better than any drug treatments that are out there. You'll find that I'm very against most drug treatments for psychological disorders. There's a few like schizophrenia or bipolar that are that's one of the only ways to treat certain parts of their disorder. But for things like panic disorder, the drugs are not needed. The CBT alone is actually the most effective long-term treatment. Next thing we're going to talk about is appraisals to stress. So how do we appraise stressful situations? When we come into them, there's what's called primary and secondary appraisals. Right now we're going to talk about primary. We'll come back to the secondary later. So primary appraisals are our initial subjective evaluation of a situation. Now, when we see this situation, we're now going to balance the demands of what's potentially stressful against our ability to meet those demands. And there are three different primary appraisals to consider. That is, the situation's irrelevant, it's mostly non-stressful. Positive, mostly non-stressful because it makes you feel good. We'll come back to actually positive stress towards the end. And then also stressful situations, these are ones that are going to overtax your emotional and psychological resources. So what's going on here is your primary assessment of the situation is this situation stressful? And if it is stressful, what is stressful about it? And is that stress going to be harmful? Is this a situation that we need to react to? An important note when it comes to appraisals of stress, appraisals of situation, that is that different people are going to find different things stressful. This should be pretty self-explanatory. Shouldn't have to spend much time on this. The level of stress really depends on a few different factors. First of all, what kind of situation it is. So that is one that there might be certain kinds of situation that everybody is going to find stressful. But then there's other stress situations that certain people will find stressful, but others won't. Also important is your primary appraisals. How stressful initially do you find it? Is it, again, a positive stress, or is it a negative stress? Is it something that we can cope with? Is it something we can deal with? If not, then it's going to cause more stress. And then finally, our genetic makeup is a very important component that goes into it. Some people are genetically predisposed to not be stressed, and some people are genetically predisposed to have higher levels of stress. Let's now look at a couple different types of stressors. And that is the two main types of stressors that we view in our environment and the world around us is first, hassles. These are small stressful events. These are irritating, they can be frustrating. These are things we face on a daily basis, and we usually interpret as a stressful experience as opposed to an uplifting experience. We usually interpret as a stressful experience, but they tend to not be viewed as that stressful. It's a stress we can overcome. It's a stress we can deal with typically. However, hassles can actually become overwhelming if there are too many. So individuals who have many hassles, they have more stress in their lives. On the other hand, you have major life events that are stressful. These are things like maybe death of a loved one. These are events that are both positive or negative that have a big effect on how we live our lives and how we appraise situations. So major life event like getting a job, well, that can be stressful because now you've got a new job, but it can also reduce stress because now you have a steady income, that type of thing. So these two kinds of stressors, daily hassles, the majority of stressors we have are hassles, but then we also have major life events that can occur that can really influence how we view even those daily life hassles. An adjustment disorder is when a person is unable to to adjust to or cope with major life changes, or a specific major life change. This can cause depression or feelings of being overwhelmed. It can cause people to change behaviorally, like avoiding social interactions. They could start performing poorly at school, making reckless decisions. So these are these major life events, such as the loss of a loved one, or even the transition from high school to college. These types of things that can cause very severe emotional problems. So when we talk about stress, one of the things you have to consider is that when you're talking about the major life stressors, one thing that people can have problems with is having an adjustment disorder, and that is adjusting to these new life changes. And this is, again, I'm not talking too much here from the psychological, the abnormal psychology perspective, because we're going to talk about that next week, but it kind of gets into a little bit. You see that there are these disorders that go along with these things, like it's normal for people to have daily life and major life changes that cause stress. Those that can't deal with it, it's now a psychopathology, it's a abnormal psych, it's a disorder, and that is where you get things like adjustment disorders. There are other types of situational stressors to look at when we're talking about things like hassles, but we have to look at things also as well like frustration. Frustration is a stressor that occurs when we attempt to reach a goal but we're blocked from it. So whatever our goal is that we're trying to achieve, being blocked from it causes us frustration. This frustration causes stress. So this is beyond daily life hassles, and it is not a major life effect, but it is a something that still causes significant amounts of stress. And essentially, again, what is it? It's being blocked from achieving our goals. And then the other one we'll look at here is burnout. We'll get to another one on the next slide, but burnout is another thing where basically you become overwhelmed with whatever it is that's going on. It could be so many hassles that build up. It could be being in an unrewarding job. It basically comes when you get a lack of interest in whatever previously interested you. And this lack of interest actually causes stress as well. The last stressor we'll look at, the last stressful situation we're going to look at here is violence. So violence can cause stress. We have post-traumatic stress disorder, again, abnormal psych, where someone who has experienced an event that is traumatizing, either injury, witnessing something, so it's either physically or psychologically traumatizing, this event can cause PTSD. And PTSD is essentially where an individual has chronic stress due to nightmares, intense fear or anxiety of situations, recurring memories, these types of things that again causes such severe stress that it affects the person's life. And this is one that can be very debilitating because it can lead to things like suicide as well as other things relating to that. I'm not going to again go into it. Next week we'll go into these types of things more when we get to abnormal, or if you're interested in more, take an abnormal psych class. I really recommend it. In the next slide, there's a video to watch in relation to what we've been talking about and what we're going to talk about after that.
Have you ever wondered, why do my hands get all cold and sweaty when I'm nervous? Or why does my stomach get all tight when I'm talking to my boss? Well, today we're going to talk about our body and brain's natural reaction to danger. It's called the fight, flight, or freeze response. Now, our bodies have developed this amazing reaction to help keep us safe. For thousands of years, humans' biggest challenge was survival. They had to worry about wild animals and heights, warring tribes, and other dangers. So the body developed this instinctual way to keep us safe. Now, unfortunately, in current day, we don't have nearly as many of these real and immediate dangers. So a lot of times this reaction just makes us uncomfortable. When faced with a real and immediate danger, like a tiger, our instincts take over. We have three main reactions: fight, run away, or freeze. Now, these come naturally. We don't have to think about it. These reactions actually turn off the thinking part of our brain. It's kind of like in Star Trek when the captain says, "All power to shields," and they lower the lights on the bridge. Yes, I am a nerd. Now, the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's the part that does thinking, words, planning, that all gets mostly shut down. And the back part of our brain, which is reactive and instinctive, gets amped up. This can be really helpful if you're facing a tiger, because if you're facing a tiger and you take time to plan out what your next move is, you're most likely to be eaten. However, this is not helpful if your perceived danger is a public speech and the front part of your brain turns off, or you're asking out a date and all of a sudden you can't make words come out of your mouth. That's when it becomes a real pain. Our body does other things to try and keep us safe. It sends extra blood to the big muscles, which takes the blood flow away from our extremities, like our hands and feet. So that's where the phrase cold feet comes from. It makes us start to sweat, so our hands will often get cold and sweaty, or cold and clammy. It turns on the adrenaline glands. Those start pumping out. This gives us energy for a quick burst to either run away or punch someone. But later on, that adrenaline gives us the shakes. It turns off our digestive system because we don't really need to be digesting that hamburger when we're running away from a tiger. However, when our digestive system turns off, that can cause all sorts of problems. a decreased appetite, a tight feeling in the stomach, dry mouth, and even people could get the runs or wet their pants. Obviously, these are all outcomes that we don't really want. The fight, flight, freeze response also tightens the muscles. It heightens some senses, like vision gets pinpointed, creating tunnel vision. Our breathing rate gets shorter and shallower, so we're breathing faster but not deeper, and our heart rate goes up. The fight, flight, freeze response also temporarily turns off the immune system. Now, that's also a good thing because, again, it's all power to shields. We're putting all power to keeping ourselves alive. But if the fight, flight, freeze response is turned on all the time, then our immune system is turned off much of the time. And that's why people who are always stressed out are often getting sick. Now, with the freeze response, we sometimes see a few different things than the fight or flight response. More frequently, we'll see people feeling numb, people shrinking, hiding, or complying, just going along with what the person or the thing in power seems to be wanting. Now, this response, this fight, flight, freeze response, is really helpful, could be helpful in situations where there's real and immediate danger, and it's meant to work in short bursts. The problem that happens is when we are constantly having this reaction to things that aren't real dangers. They're just perceived threats, like a boss asking to talk with us or a public speaking event. When we are constantly in the fight, flight, freeze response, then our body gets trapped in this elevated state for a long period of time. This leads to exhaustion, insomnia, muscle tension, digestive problems, and frequent illnesses. In an upcoming video, we are going to teach you how to train your mind and body to respond differently to threats, to resolve anxiety, and to train your nervous system to return to calm quickly. For now, the best thing you can do is to just start noticing your body's reaction. Notice what happens when you're going into fight, flight, or freeze mode, and just give it a label, like, I'm having a fight response right now. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching, and take care.
So that slide explained what I'm going to talk about on the next two slides really well, so I'm not going to spend as much time on it. Actually, just this slide, I cut it down because that video is so good. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to point out that video explains this really well. So what is going on here? You've got the fight, flight, or freeze response. Your book just calls it fight or flight. A lot of people still misinterpret this as just fight or flight, but in actuality, you've got fight, flight, or freeze because some people respond by freezing. And what's going on here is when there's just this instantaneous, stressful trigger, we have to react in a way that is quicker than the mind can usually process. So this is usually where the mind processes either fight or flight, but some people again freeze. And there's a lot of basically responses that are going into getting the body ready for this. I could go on and on about it, though the video talked about it pretty good. I'll just finish by saying you see this sometimes when you see those videos where someone gets a jump scare. Someone jumps out of, like, let's say a trash can as someone's walking by. Well, some people will jump away. That's the flight. Some people actually will punch the person that's jumping out at them. That's the fight. They're not even aware of what they're doing. It would be difficult to punish that person because that fight response is happening quicker than they can mentally process. Other people, on the other hand, freeze. Just watched a video the other day of a rally car accident, and people were sitting in the line of where a crash was coming, and there was like 15 people, and 14 of them all ran, and the last person just sat there. Fortunately for them, the rally car stopped before it got to them, but the point is they just sat there. They froze. So that's why you can't just have the fight or flight. It's fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about is general adaptation syndrome, GAS, and this is basically where the body's reaction to a stressful situation follows a predictable format, and if it doesn't follow this format, it actually can cause some pretty severe problems to the individual. this format is first there's the alarm stage. This is the initial reaction to the stress. It's marked by activating the fight, flight, or freeze response. And during this time, it's basically instantaneous. So the body doesn't even really have time to change the physiological yet, other than getting prepared to fight or flight or freeze. Then we have the resistance stage, and this is where a continued stress will cause the physiological response to return to normal levels, but the body is using up stores of energy during this time. And then finally, the exhaustion stage, and this is the body's reaction to long-term continued stress, where the body will start to break down. So the normal response is to have this alarm, then to go to resistance, and then back to normal. However, some people, whether the stressor continues or their body doesn't react properly, typically because of the stressor continuing. This is people who are under chronic stress. They reach this exhaustion stage here, and this is where this continued stress will actually start to break down the body. The body's internal organs will start to break down. The body's immune system will weaken. These are the types of things that can cause long-term negative consequences to the body due to prolonged stress. I told you we'd come back to secondary appraisals. Let's look at those secondary appraisals now. So again, the primary appraisal is whether it's a stressor or not. The secondary appraisal is if it's a stressor, can you handle it or not? So what's going on here is we've got different types of coping to deal with these stressors once we've determined that something is a stressor. First is problem-focused coping. This is where we decrease the stress by solving problems through seeking information, either by changing our own behavior, taking action to resolve it. These types of things are where we basically problem solve the stressor, and we reduce the stress by solving the problem in a sense. Then there's the emotion-focused coping. This is where we will basically seek out the support and sympathy of others, or we'll avoid or deny the situation. So emotion focus is where we use our emotions by, in a sense, we're dealing with emotional distress. We do it by seeking out our support, so our attachment figures, our loved ones, those we've formed attachment bonds to, or by avoiding the situation. Okay, that's about enough of talking about stress. From here on out, and we'll still talk about some of it a bit, but I do want to, before we get into looking at maybe those immune responses to long-term effects of stress, stuff like that, let's look at one other branch of psychology, and that's health psychology. So health psychology is interested in the study of how psychological factors relate to the promotion and maintenance of health. So many of you are pre-med, you're interested in health. Well, health psychology is an important component of physiological health. The way the mind works actually affects the body. So what is health psychology interested in? It's focused on the prevention and treatment of stress-related illnesses, as well as other psychological things that affect physiological health. So there's this big basically way of looking at health psychology you see over here on the right, and it kind of gets into the things that health psychology look at. And I should say, just like when we look at all these topics, there's just too much to go into with health psychology to talk about even in one lecture. So you're kind of getting an overview here. Part of looking at, well, why is health psychology looking at physiological health important? Because we have the mind-body connection. This refers to how thoughts, beliefs, and emotions can actually produce physiological changes. These physiological changes can be both beneficial and detrimental to your health and well-being. the way we think about things actually affects our physiological health. This is where you get to things like the placebo effect that we talked about earlier in the semester, and how a placebo, that is a sugar pill, if we are given it to treat a physiological symptom, it actually helps us heal faster if we believe that that's going to help us heal. And a lot of people just ignore this component of psychology, thinking that it's pseudoscience and it's not real, but there's real legitimate research that shows how the placebo effect affects physiological health, not just psychological health. How basically the way the mind works can affect the physical body. Your book uses an example of monks who train to regulate different physiological functions in their body, how they can actually, through years and years and years of training, train to basically change the temperature in their hands by up to 7 degrees, whereas those that aren't trained in it can only change it by about 1 to 2 degrees with just a little bit of training. So it just shows that there is this mind-body connection, that we can affect the physiological functions of the body through the mind. This gets us to psychosomatic symptoms. So psychosomatic symptoms are going to be symptoms that basically have no physiological cause. They only have a psychological cause. So these are real, sometimes painful physical symptoms of when there's no physiological cause, just again a psychological cause. Things like stress can cause this. So headache, muscle pain, stomach problems, increased susceptibility to colds and flus. This can be caused by, again, worry, stress, anxiety, where it has that negative effect on the immune system. So psychosomatic, what's that derived from? Mind and body. So and again, when I'm talking about this, I really try and avoid the pseudoscience of thinking that we can do things with our mind that are beyond the control of our mind. No, I'm not trying to say that. I'm trying to say that there are things that we can do with our minds that affect the body. Typically, these are negative, these psychosomatic symptoms. Stress causes things like stomach problems. You can have intestinal problems due to psychological conditions. Actually, there's quite a few psychological conditions that can cause intestinal issues. A lot of intestinal issues do come from a psychological component. So it's something to just consider, that psychology and the way the mind works is an important component to looking at the health of the body, not just the health of the mind. And I've already talked about this some, but I just want to go back to this, that the immune system is basically it's the system that's designed to fight off bacteria, viruses, other foreign and toxic substances. Pretty self-explanatory, and not anything that we need to go into there. The point is, though, is that it has been shown that things like stress, chronic stress, actually weaken the immune system. So this is where you get that mind-body connection together. Now let's go back to talking about the effects of stress. We'll look at one of the resistances, and I talked about genetics. One of them is hardiness. So this hardiness is a combination of 3 traits. That's control, commitment, and challenge. This is how much control you feel you have in your life, how committed you are to what you're doing, and how you feel that you can overcome challenges. And these are the types of things that buffer us from the harmful effects of stress. Stress may be still there, but we are buffered from it, so we don't have those negative immune functions and things like that. So this reduces our chance of developing these psychosomatic conditions from stress. Related to hardiness is our locus of control. So locus of control is, and we talked about this a bit last week, I believe it was, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, but this is your feeling that you are in control of the situation. An internal locus of control is basically where you feel you are in control, you feel you determine your future, you're in control of your life. The external locus of control is where you feel that there's really nothing that you can do. You don't have much influence. Your life is out of your control. Internal is active. External is passive. The thing here is, though, is that if we have an internal locus of control, we tend to deal with stress better. Whereas an external locus of control, we tend to have more difficulty dealing with stress. Maybe this external locus of control came from something like learned helplessness, where we had a problem in the past where we couldn't get away from it, and now our mind just continually associates with not being able to get out of problems. And that's actually, going back to fight, flight, or freeze, learned helplessness is tied to freezing. So those who were possibly abused as children, things like that, they're more likely to freeze in the fight or flight rather than the other two. And that also leads to this external locus of control. Related is optimism versus pessimism. So optimism, it's, again, these are personality traits, but these are relatively stable personality traits. People who are optimistic think good things will happen to them. People who are pessimistic believe that bad things will happen to them. There's an argument to be said for there being more of a spectrum rather than people just being optimistic or pessimistic. There's some people say realistic, where they're a less pessimistic. So they're sometimes optimistic, but in situations where maybe they've been burned before, or where they believe that there's truly bad things going to happen, they're realistic, so they're pessimistic in those situations, but they're not as pessimistic as some people who are always pessimistic. That's just something to look at. What is it relating here? Well, people who are optimistic tend to react to stress better than those who are pessimistic. Those that are pessimistic, they tend to be more chronically stressed. Those that are optimistic, they tend to ignore the stress or be able to overcome it. Another related thing, I'm just rapid firing them at you here, is the behavioral types. This is types of behavior that people have. We're going to look at A, B, and D here. So type A behavior is looked at as someone who's impatient, hostile, a workaholic, who's hostile when frustrated, has a habitual sense of time urgency, maybe has rapid or explosive speaking, listed as being a workaholic. We'll come back to type A in a minute though. Next type is type B. This is someone who's more easygoing, calm, relaxed, patient. And then finally type D is, and I don't know what happened to type C, we only look at type A and B typically, and sometimes D, but type D is someone who's in chronic distress of negative affect. This is the type of person who is always worrying, always irritable, always gloomy, tends to be a person who's more pessimistic. Also someone who's shy and reserved, maybe is lacking self-assurance. I told you we'd talk more about type A. Well, type A has changed over time. So type A in the 70s, it was basically looked at as it was on the previous slide. That is someone who was hostile, urgent, workaholic, that type of person. And it was linked to having a higher rates of heart attacks, though the research became mixed on that pretty quickly. I will say the people who wrote your book really are probably type A personalities, and they don't like the negative connotations with it, so they try and find reasons to look at the positive side of it. Which got to the 1980s. Type A was looked at as being more, again, easily frustrated, but also depressed, anxious, or angry. But again, the links to cardiac disease were still inconsistent. And finally, in the 90s, it would be more people who are angry and hostile much of the time, but doesn't express the emotions publicly. And specifically this type of type A person. So really what's looked at here is type A, who is type A has changed over time. And in the 90s and into today, we get this type of, the type A people are those who feel angry and hostile. In this type, who the authors don't associate themselves with, but this type are the people who are more likely to have heart attacks. So the link to type A and heart attacks is this specific type of type A. Kind of confusing when you say that now there's different types of type A. Just something to consider. Again, I'm throwing rapid fire at you. There's a lot to cover, and I'm just going over all of it briefly. What are things that we can do to manage stress, on the other hand? This may be interesting to you because stay-at-home order, the pandemic, all of the things that are going on in the world, it might cause increases in stress. So this gets us to what can we do to reduce stress. One thing is learn to relax. Well, how do you learn to relax? One way is biofeedback. Biofeedback is where we record and display responses and voluntarily learn to control them. So wearing a heart monitor is a good way. So wearing like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, something that's taking your heart rate, and learning to control your heart. So by tracking it and learning to relax ourselves and actually seeing it go down, we can become better at it. Progressive relaxation. So this is where you practice tensing and relaxing muscle groups. So if you're stressed out quite a bit, one thing you can do is tense a muscle group and relax it. But you can actually practice this when you're not stressed out by tensing a group and relaxing it, and you get used to the feeling of relaxing muscles. So through this, and by taking in the things that are most tense, like our shoulders or our legs, and tensing them and relaxing them, and tensing them and relaxing them, we become progressively more relaxed physically. Last thing is meditation and yoga, things like that, where you focus on your breathing, you clear your head of thoughts. What's going on here is basically this, just learning to relax. There's nothing specifically special about meditation and yoga. The research has found that there's nothing. It's just that this is one of the methods that you can use to relax your body, just like that biofeedback and progressive relaxation. Okay, let's talk about conflict for a minute. This is one of the last two things we're going to talk about here. So conflict is the feeling you get when you must choose between two or more incompatible possibilities or outcomes. There's three main types of conflict that we'll look at here. That is approach. This is when you have to choose between two pleasurable consequences. So you've got two things you want, but you can't have both. So this causes conflict. It causes conflict because you want both, but you can only have one of them. And how you make that decision is one of the things that determines how you deal with conflict. The next is avoid, when you have two disagreeable consequences, but you have to choose between them. So again, this is where you've got you have to make a choice. So there's a conflict because you have to choose between two disagreeable outcomes, but you have to make the decision between them. Obviously, you don't want either of them, but you have to choose between them. And the final is approach, and this one's a bit more difficult to explain. I'm not going to go into it too much, but this is basically where you get a situation where, and this is actually more likely to be real life, and that is where you've got both good and bad things for both choices. It's not just you have to choose approach between cake and ice cream, or avoidance, you've got to choose between going to jail or paying a fine. It's more of you've got real life where you might have Things like you've got two choices for a job. One of those jobs is across the country, but it pays more. So there's benefits to it. It pays more. But there's drawbacks, there's disagreeable aspects, because you have to move away from your family. But then the other is maybe there's one that's nearby, but it's not doing something you want to do necessarily, but it's nearby. So there's pleasurable, it's nearby, you don't have to move, but it's not necessarily the job you want. So you have to choose between those two types of things. So and that's what really most conflict in real life is actually about, is when you've got just lots of things to weigh, not just positive or negative things. So that's what approach avoidance is. The next thing is the 5 styles of dealing with conflict, and this is what, I hope you're listening to this, or I hope you're watching this, because this is what your weekly assignment is for. Your weekly discussion is the 5 styles of dealing with conflict. We've got a lot of things going on in the world today. We've got the protests going on. We're getting more and more progressive as a people, as a species, and hopefully these protests help us get more progressive. But what is going on is we've got conflict that's going on. We've got conflict between the people and the police. We've got conflict between those people of color, specifically in this case black people, but just people of color in general, and the police. And as well as you've got conflict between anybody who's not police and police. So those are all these conflicts that are occurring, and these protests are designed in a way to bring more equality to people, as well as to reduce what's going on with the problems with the police. So how can we deal with this? Well, there's a spectrum of ways of dealing with conflict, and there's 2 things to consider. First is assertiveness, and second is cooperativeness. So over here on the right, we've got cooperative. Over here on the left, we've got uncooperative. On the top, we've got assertive. That's where you actually actively try and resolve it. And on the bottom, you've got unassertive, where you're not actively trying to resolve it. And you've got 5 things that come into here. So these 5 styles of dealing with conflict. The first is avoidance. The avoidance is basically where by avoiding or ignoring the conflict, it'll go away. So you believe that just by ignoring it, the problem will go away. And this is actually the most common way that people deal with conflict, is through avoidance. This is why things get as bad as they are today. People have stuck their head in the sand. They've tried to avoid it. It's an unpleasant situation, so if you don't think about it, it'll go away. If it's not something that affects you directly, it'll go away. It doesn't matter that it's affecting other people. I'm being sarcastic if you can't tell. And that is, we get this down here, it's where there's no cooperation going on, and there's no assertiveness. It's just where you're avoiding it. You're not actively cooperating, and you're not actively trying to resolve the situation. The second is accommodation. Accommodation is where where you basically, people give in, where you hate conflict and you are doing something to please people. So you are cooperative, but you're not trying to solve the problem, you're just giving in. And this is where you get accommodating, and this is where people get taken advantage of. People who are accommodating tend to get taken advantage of in the world because of how they don't try to get their issue solved. They just go along with the flow. So they're not avoiding the conflict, they're actually going against their own self-interest sometimes to accommodate others. The next is competing or domination, right? This is an interesting way to think about it, because it was an interesting speech given by Trump last week, I think it was, where he basically said that the governors and the city leaders needed to dominate the people. This is a type of dealing with conflict where you're assertive, but you're not cooperative. This is the type of dealing with conflict where you're aggressive, where you're manipulative, where it's all about getting your own way. It's not about cooperating with people. It's not about compromising. It's not about collaborating. It's all about getting your own way through assertive, competing domination. And going back to what was said by him in that speech, it really tells a lot to how he deals with conflict, in that his go-to in dealing with conflict is to dominate, to his way or the highway. It's aggression and manipulation. And it really goes a long way towards showing his personality. Next one is compromise, and this one's in the middle. So compromising here in the middle, this is kind of a middle ground of cooperating and a middle ground of assertiveness. I would actually move cooperating, compromising more over here. There's more cooperation, but there's middle assertiveness. One thing that I see here is in business and in a lot of people who talk about the 5 styles of dealing with conflict, they talk about compromising as actually a bad thing. And when you look at it from the psychological side, though, of the things, of the 5 styles, this is the second best style. Meaning compromise is where you give up something, but you also gain something. You get part of what you want, but you don't get all of what you want. The reality of the situation here is, and let's talk about collaborating, and I'll come back to compromising. Collaborating or integration, so collaborating up here, integration is high cooperativeness, high assertiveness. This is where both sides are trying to find a solution that gets both sides what they want. This is ideal. This is the best way of dealing with conflict, where you've got a large amount of cooperativeness, you've got a large amount of assertiveness. Both parties are trying to, both sides are trying to get what they want, but they're also cooperating. They're understanding that the other side needs to get what they want as well. Collaboration is the ideal. But I'll go back to compromising now, and that is the ideal is not always, and actually quite often not achievable. Both sides can't get everything they want. When we look at our conflicts we've got going on with the police now, both sides can't get everything they want. So what is often the case is where you get a compromise, where you don't necessarily get everything you want. You get most of what you want, and the other side gets most of what they want. Again, the ideal is collaboration, where both sides get everything they want. But if that's not possible, then compromise is what needs to be done. And this is when we talk about politics, one thing, compromise needs to be done, because there are cases where both sides cannot get everything they want. And this is where compromise comes in, where you work towards getting both sides as much as possible. Okay, enjoy your weekly discussion dealing with the 5 styles of conflict. Last thing I want to talk about here just real quick is positive psychology. So positive psychology is basically the scientific study of optimal human functioning. It's related to health psychology, and it's related to humanistic psychology, in that looking at allowing individuals to reach their potentials, to reach the optimal human functioning. Understanding positive adaptive parts of human life, the fulfilling aspects, and it really has 3 main domains that it comes down to. That is the positive emotions, the positive individual traits, and the positive institutions we have in life. So positive psychology is interested in getting people, and we talked about this with things like hierarchy of needs and all of those, getting people to be more positive in life. And when we look at what's going on in the world today, and there's so many negative things out there, but we have to take the positive from the negative. The positive from the protests that are going on is that we are getting towards a more optimal society. We are working towards it. We're not getting there as fast as we'd like, the fact that we even need to do it is something that's not necessarily a positive thing. But the fact of the matter is we are working towards a better future, more equality, less harm to humans, that type of thing. And when we're looking at positive psychology and stress, well, we have to look at eustress. That is pleasant, desirable stress, stress that may be helpful. We have low levels of positive stress is actually good in our life because it helps us do things in life. I talked about this before in strategies for test taking. Having no stress at all can actually be harmful for test taking, because then it doesn't keep us engaged, it doesn't keep us interested. So having a low amount of stress is a good thing in many situations. It keeps us working towards our goals. Yes, high amounts of stress, definitely not good, but low amounts of stress can be positive, can be pleasant, it can be desirable. It helps get us towards it helps us achieve our goals. So this set of slides was relatively short, but there was a lot to go through, but it was relatively quick. We talked about stress, panic disorder, we looked at appraisals of stress, we looked at stressful experiences, stress responses. Then we transitioned into health psychology and how the immune system and stress responses work, as well as things like psychosomatic and how the mind affects the body. We'll talk about some of that more later. Then we looked at resistances to stress, the behavioral types, conflict, which is a big deal with what's going on in the world right now, and finished with positive psychology. And I just recommend that's one of the things you can do is just stay positive. It's actually long-term positive health outcomes can come from staying positive. Thanks. Come on back.